Thanks for coming out today. As Francesco said, I'm going to talk about neuroscience, specifically about neuroplasticity, which is a new understanding of the human brain and how we learn and grow. And I'm going to first give you a little bit of background about that. And then I'm going to talk about the implications of this new understanding of the brain for language learning and for learning in general. So before I start, just a little bit about me. Again, my name's Stephen Artinian. I'm a brain-based coach. I do leadership and personal development coaching. And I was trained in brain-based coaching, which applies findings from neuroscience to the field of human development and growth. And I actually trained at an institution called the Neuro Leadership Institute here in New York, which was founded by a gentleman from Australia named David Rock. And David Rock basically did a lot of research on the human brain. Actually, he reviewed a lot of research done by other people, and he worked with neuroscientists, and he condensed this great body of knowledge, of information, into 6 key insights about the brain and what that means for how we learn, how we grow, and how we attain our goals. And so I'm going to go over each one of these insights one at a time in a little, not too much detail, just a brief overview, and then we're going to talk about the implications of those for language learning and for learning in general. So the first insight is that our brain is a connection machine. Now, it was initially thought that up until fairly recently, until about 20 years ago, that a child's brain was very plastic while the adult brain was static. That once you became an adult, your brain didn't change anymore. Turns out that's not the case. The child's brain is more plastic than the adult brain, there's no question about that. But the adult brain is plastic as well. And in fact, it forms new neural connections throughout your life. Your brain actually, or our brain, actually changes its form and its structure based through the very thoughts and activities we engage in. It actually changes its form and its structure. And every time we learn something new, the brain forms new neural connection. It forms new neural maps. And in fact, all the experiences we have in our life actually are encoded in our brain in a series of neural maps. And during this talk, I'm going to use the term hardwiring or map. If you don't like those terms, you could substitute pathway, association, connection. It really all means the same thing. But the brain forms this network of maps, and maps nested within maps, and maps of maps. And basically everything that you've ever experienced in your life, every thought, emotion, experience, belief, it's all encoded in your brain in this series of nested maps. And the brain's actually, its main function is to make connections. Its intrinsic functionality is to make these connections. And when it does, actually there are some physical and chemical changes that occur at the level of our neurons when they link together. Making these connections actually feels really good. I think we've all experienced the famous aha moment. And the aha moment actually occurs when we're forming a new connection, usually in different areas of our brain. 2 different maps are connecting. That's actually the aha moment. And this actually feels good because when this occurs, there's actually a release of neurotransmitters. There are a lot of neurotransmitters, but the 2 primary ones are neuroadrenaline, which is the chemical of alertness, and dopamine, which is the chemical of interest. And we're going to talk about interest and being in a toward state and why that's so important for learning. So I said before that every experience you've ever had in your life is basically encoded in your brain in the form of a neural map. What that means is that no 2 brains are alike, that each one of our brains is fundamentally different at a neurological level. In fact, there's a neuroscientist named John Rady who's actually estimated that there are more ways to connect the neurons in the human brain than there are atoms in the universe, which is really a mind-boggling concept. I mean, there are over 3 trillion dynamic connections in constant flux in your brain, which means that there are unlimited possibilities for perceiving the world, for perceiving reality. I think that, a lot of us, we know this at an intuitive level, that each one of us is different. But this is the scientific evidence that this is really the case. Now, when I say no two brains are alike, I should also, preface that really means up close. If it really depends on the function we're talking about. If we're talking about moving your hand, moving your foot, breathing, even though those are complex things in themselves, the neural pathways for each one of us are relatively similar when it comes to those activities. But when we get down to more subtle things like your motivation or your abilities or your belief system, at those levels, each one of us is totally different. And our neural maps are different. And we're going to talk about, again, how that's why that's so important as we go along. Now, the brain hardwires everything it can. Why does the brain do that? Okay, well, first of all, the brain is obviously extremely complex, but when we think of the human brain, we tend to think of the prefrontal cortex. It's kind of what makes us human, our ability to think through things. And the prefrontal cortex, and since we're actually the word cortex, since we're among polyglots here, the word cortex derives from Latin. It means bark. The word in Italian, corteccia, means bark. And cortex derives from that, from Latin. And actually, the prefrontal cortex is actually like a crumpled piece of paper that's on top of your skull, that covers the top of your head. And it only accounts for about 5% of your brain's total area. That's where working memory takes place. Working memory is what we use when we want to learn something new. Even though in this area, though, the prefrontal cortex, which we call the PFC, to make it shorter in brain-based coaching, even though your PFC only accounts for 5% of your brain, it uses a lot of energy. It uses a lot of oxygen and a lot of glucose. And therefore, what the brain does is anytime there's a behavior that's repetitive, for example, an action or a behavior that you do on a continuous basis, the brain wants to push that down. It doesn't want the working memory to take up valuable real estate. It pushes that down into the unconscious part of your brain, to the subcortical areas, and it tries to hardwire those. And it basically does that because it's like most things in nature, it's very energy conscious. It's trying to conserve energy. So I'll give you an example to maybe make this a little bit more clear. So when I was a boy, I grew up in New York State, where, as most of those of you from New York know, it snows a lot here. So when it would snow, we would go out sledding. We'd find a nice big hill to go sledding down. And when we got to the hill, right after a snowfall, there'd be virgin snow, nice white virgin snow. And we would go down our sled. And, the first time you went down, the sled would basically go any way you wanted it to go. But after a couple of times, without even realizing it, the sled started going down the same path every single time. And that's because that was easy to do that. And that's exactly what happens in the brain. Once you've formed a habit, the brain tends to default to that mode because it's easy. This is why creating new habits is work, because the brain doesn't really want to do that. The brain doesn't want to create a new habit. It's energy efficient and it wants to drive everything down. So creating a new habit requires work, and we're going to talk about that a bit more. So this hardwiring I talked about, it drives our automatic perception, how we perceive the world. We tend to perceive the world as we are, as our neural networks are, not really as the world is. And this happens really outside of our awareness because it's hardwired. Now, this hardwiring, once it's actually been laid down, it's almost impossible to deconstruct it. There's a law in neuroscience that's called Hebb's law, named after a famous neuroscientist named Hebb. And it basically says that neurons that fire together, wire together. And what this means basically is that when we learn something new, our neurons are forming new connections. And when two neurons fire together on a repeated basis, there are chemical changes in each neuron that cause those two neurons to link together more strongly. So what happens is that when those two neurons fire repeatedly, they hardwire a habit. And once that habit's been formed, it's really, really hard. It's like that path in the snow I told you about. It's like a path in the forest. It would be a lot of work to cover a path in the forest. You'd have to get your shovel out and cover it up with dirt. And even if you did that, there'd probably still be a trace. Or it's kind of like trying to deviate the course of a river. Sometimes it's easier to just make a canal than to deviate the course of the river. So once you have this existing wiring, it's very difficult to deconstruct it. So the good news is that it's easy to create new wiring. And in fact, that's the brain's favorite activity, is to create new wiring. And it's kind of like making a new path in the forest. So rather than using the old path, and in fact, step back for a second. So this new path in the forest is difficult to make at first. As I said, creating a new habit is not easy. But once you've done it a couple of times, you use the new path, every single time you do it, it gets easier. And the more you use the new path, the more you reinforce this new neural pathway, the more the old pathway, almost just like a trail in the woods, starts to get overgrown. The plants start to overgrow in that trail, and pretty soon, you're not using that trail anymore. Or your sled is going down another path because you've made a new neural network. And this is really what we try to focus on when we're learning something new, on trying to create a new neural new wiring in your brain. So that was a really fast introduction to these 6 insights from neuroscience. So what does that mean for language learning? And what does it mean for learning in general? So the first one I think is everyone here I think knows this intuitively, but that age is not a barrier to language learning. We all know that here because a lot of us, for example, I'm 55, I'm a better language learner now than I was when I was 25. We know that intuitively, but I think that the neuroscience tells us why that's the case. And the reason is what I said, that our brain has the ability to form new connections throughout our lives. And when you're learning a new language, you're basically forming new neural pathways in your brain. It's very interesting because people have shown that there's a study, for example, at the University of Haifa in Israel, showed that under controlled environment, the adults were actually learned a language faster than children. Other studies have shown that learning a new language it's an excellent way of preventing early onset dementia. I mentioned before that when we learn something new, our brain changes its structure and form. So if we go out of the realm of language learning, people who practice meditation on a long-term basis, their brains actually change. Their amygdala, which is a part of the brain that's in the subcortical part of the brain, and it's the center of the fight or flight response. People who meditate regularly have a smaller amygdala, and their prefrontal cortex is actually bigger than in the average person. So the meditation actually changes the structure of your brain, and exactly the same thing happens when you learn a new language. It actually changes the new structure of your brain. People before. An old way of understanding the brain was based on the idea of localization, that all brain functions, or basically everything that you know how to do, all your senses, including language, were localized in a particular area of your brain. This is true. There are areas of your brain, like the famous Broca area, that are specialized in a certain function, like language. But it turns out that that's really not so important, because what they've discovered from people who've suffered from strokes was that even if a particular brain area has been damaged by a stroke or some catastrophic injury, another part of your brain can actually take over that role, and it can actually perform the same function. That's called sensory substitution. It was thought that the Broca area was vital for language. It turns out there are people whose the left hemisphere of their brain has been totally decayed, but they have no Broca area, and they're actually able to speak with no problem, which shows that other brain areas are obviously able to do the job of the famous Broca area. Some of the most remarkable breakthroughs, and the whole field of neuroplasticity was actually discovered by working with stroke victims, and particularly through the before and after therapy. There's a man named Edward Taub, who's a brilliant neuroscientist who has a center for stroke victims in Atlanta, Georgia, and he's helped people regain their speech, regain use of a limb, regain their sense of balance. And he was able to do this through something called constraint-induced therapy. And what he's done brain scans of these people before the therapy and after the therapy. And after the therapy, there's an actual change in the structure of their brain. That certain areas that actually light up on an MRI that didn't light up before, as a result of the therapy. So my message here, I think, is that if stroke patients can learn to use their limbs again, I'll give you another fantastic example. There was a Mexican-American brilliant man, Paul Rita Ibach. Unfortunately, he's passed away, but he was a polyglot, grew up in the Bronx, New York. I was born in the Bronx, so I have a little, and he basically was able to help congenitally blind people who couldn't see from birth, to actually perceive some sense of vision simply by receiving a tactile impulse on their tongue. And that proves that you don't actually see through your eyes, but you actually see through your brain. So what I was saying, if stroke patients can do this, then you certainly, at any age, you can learn not only a new language. You can learn to dance, you can learn to skydive, you can learn to do anything really, if you really set your mind to it. And it's not just positive thinking, it's backed by neuroscience. So, right now I've been talking about how fantastic neuroscience is, or neuroplasticity is, and it is. It's a wonderful thing. But it's also a double-edged sword, because the variability the brain has to form new connections and learn new things also can reinforce bad habits. So, for example, if you have a limiting belief that I'm not good at learning languages, or I'm too old to learn a language, or I'll never be able to improve my accent in that language, you're just going to reinforce that existing wiring. And it's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And something else I think that we all know, but again, this is backed scientifically, that our beliefs really, really matter. So when it comes to the field of neuroplasticity, it's really a double-edged sword, and we have to be smart. We have to get our brains on our side, because our brains weren't designed to make us happy. They were designed for us to survive. But if we're smart enough to use neuroplasticity to our advantage, we can actually do incredible things. So neuroplasticity also explains why something called comprehensible input works. A few weeks ago, Paul Doucette, who's also from New York, gave a talk about the comprehensible input and why this, and he referred to the work of a linguist named Stephen Krashen. Now, I'm not an expert on comprehensible input, but basically what it's about is learning a language through natural means, through meaningful input in a low anxiety situation. And this has been shown to be a very good way of learning a language for adults. It's actually very similar to the way children learn. And again, I think that neuroplasticity explains why comprehensible input is so effective, because our brain works in a very holistic way. You know, when we learn something new, our brain is forming new mental maps across different regions of our brain area. It's connecting bits of information in different areas of our brain, which is exactly how comprehensible input works. Also, I mentioned before that the dopamine is very important for learning. And if the input that we're receiving is something that really interests us, and we're doing it in a non-threatening way, okay, we're much more likely to have a wider field of perception, to have better cognition, to be more aware, to be able to accept feedback better. All these things, explain why comprehensible input makes sense. From a neuroplasticity perspective. And I should also mention something else, that there's something called the flow state that I think is also closely related. We've all experienced this. Some people call it flow state. Some people call it being in the zone. Professional athletes really, really they strive to achieve this. When an athlete's in the zone, people just kind of know it. And it's almost like a state of effortless performance. People are performing really well without really trying. If you see a tennis player in the zone, they're doing really great until they figure out they're doing really great. And then they start to try really hard, and they tend to kind of go out of the zone, and they tend to mess up at that point. So this flow state is actually really interesting, because when we're in flow state, our brain is actually generating something called alpha brain waves. And when the brain is generating alpha brain waves, we tend to lose all track of time. We tend to be totally focused on what we're doing, totally interested in what we're doing, and we're not really trying. And when we're in this state, we're at our best, where it's our peak performance state. That's also the state where we're most likely to have an insight. An insight, that eureka moment, is when we make a new connection. When we make a new connection in our brain actually generates gamma brain waves, which feels like a burst of energy. And in fact, when we're in the world of coaching, when a person has an aha moment and they have this kind of burst of energy and insight, what we try to do at that point is get the person committed to taking an action. Because it doesn't last that long. It consumes a lot of energy, so you really want to get the person to really take action on that insight that they had. So again, when it comes to language learning, that being in that flow state, which comprehensible input really cultivates, then that's when you're basically the best state of mind for learning something new. And another interesting thing is that this peak performance is associated with something called the Goldilocks mix. The Goldilocks mix is basically the right balance between neuroadrenaline, which is the chemical of alertness, and we want to be alert, but we don't want to be like so alert where we get stressed out. And we also want to have the right amount of dopamine, which is the chemical of interest. When we're striving towards something, we have dopamine. So we want to have the right balance. Another implication of this is that self-directed learning is really the best way of learning anything new, and particularly a language, because, as I said before, no two brains are alike. Each brain is different. So there's really no one right method for learning. I mean, there might be a right method for me, and there might be a right method for Francesco or for Kevin or for Maria Grazia, but there isn't going to be a right method for everyone. And because all of our brains are different. And with self-directed learning also, when we set our own agenda, when we learn something on our own, we tend to learn it a lot better. We're a lot more inspired, we're a lot more motivated, we're likely to retain the information when we learn it ourselves rather than having someone else tell us how to learn it. And I think that with self-directed learning also, if we're learning something that we're really interested in, again, we have that, we're interested, so we've got high levels of dopamine we want to achieve. So self-directed learning, I think, is really a key. Again, something in the world of coaching, we really try to have people set their own agenda, set their own goals, set their own time frame. And it's the same thing when you're learning a language. You don't let anyone else dictate to you what the right way is. You have to find out what the right way is for you. And if that works, then go with it. Stick to that thing that works. So now, reward is better than threat. I mentioned it before, our amygdala. So, our amygdala is this ancient part of our brain that's actually really useful. But it was probably more useful when we lived on the savannah in Africa. And the reason I'm saying that is it divides the world into rewards and threats. It's very simple, black and white. Is it good or is it bad? It gives more importance to threats. That was really important for our survival, because when we came out of the trees into the savannah, if we didn't really pay a lot of attention to threats, we got eaten by a tiger or a lion. In the modern world, there are less threats, at least for those of us who are fortunate enough to live in a rich country. But our brain doesn't know this. This is why I'm saying we need to outsmart our own brain sometimes. So our brain tends to give more importance to threats. You see this when people are driving down the road and they see a car accident and people slow down. In the U.S. we call this rubbernecking, to look at the accident. It's not very often, or maybe never. I've never seen anyone slow down to look at a beautiful sunset. If you watch the news, it's all bad news. There's a whole, people are more interested in bad news than good news, because their brain is wired to do that. So the problem with that is when we're in this threat state, the threat state is really not good for learning something new. The threat state narrows your field of perception. It lowers your cognition. It makes you less likely to collaborate with other people, less likely to try something new, less likely to take risks. You judge yourself. It just doesn't work. So when we're coaching and when you're learning something new, you really want to cultivate a toward state. You really want to focus on what you're doing right and not what you're doing wrong. You want to focus on the solution rather than the problem. If you focus on the problem, if you go back to that double-edged sword again, by focusing on the problem, you tend to reinforce existing wiring. If you focus on the solution, you're creating new wiring. So we want to focus on the solution, we want self-directed learning, and we want to try to cultivate a reward state. Have a vision. Having a vision is very important for learning anything new. It's interesting, vision is all about why you want something. It's about what you want to achieve, where you want to go. Vision is really different from how you're going to get there. Actually, it's interesting, there are two different brain systems. The system that focuses on why and how are different. And I think a lot of people, when they have a vision and they immediately go to how am I going to do it, and they get frustrated. And so one of the things we do in coaching, and I think it's important in learning a language, is to really focus on the vision. And vision is something that's very visceral. It's something that's very emotional. So you try to imagine, what will it be like when I speak Mandarin Chinese at a B2 level? What will it be like when I speak Dutch at a C1 level? What will I be doing in that moment? And try to find something, it could be a person that you really wanted to meet, a job you wanted to get, going to that country and being able to connect with the people on a local level, being able to read a novel in that language, being able to understand How I Met Your Mother in Mandarin Chinese, if they have it in Mandarin Chinese, I don't know. But something that you can really connect with, that every day when you wake up, you can think of that vision and you're like, yes, I want that. So having a vision is really important. Vision is like the book or the song that you're writing. So once you have a vision, then you need a strategy, how to get there. And if the vision is a book, the strategy are the chapters of your book. And the individual actions would basically be the words or the paragraphs in those chapters. So once you have this vision, you want to take small steps every day. If you want to achieve something big, you really need to chunk it down. It's a lot better to, and this is from a neuroscience perspective, it's a lot better to do something consistently every day, just for 10 or 15 minutes a day, half an hour a day, whatever amount of time you have, is a lot better than sporadic cram sessions. Because, first of all, by taking small chunks, you're making constant progress. You're making progress every day. The bigger goal that might seem like a mountain, if you break it down into small steps, it seems a lot more manageable. In fact, if you start from that vision that you have of, and you imagine yourself that you've achieved your goal, and then you look back, what did I do to get there? That's actually your strategy. What were the different steps I went to get there? And those small steps keep you motivated because every day you're making progress. Tony Robbins calls this CANI, constant and never-ending improvement. So the small steps every day, they keep you motivated, and they also allow something called spaced repetition, because your brain continues to learn even when you're not really trying. As I said before, when you form these new neural pathways and you're pushing them down to the subcortical area of your brain is continuing to learn when you take a break. So, for example, through spaced repetition, it turns out that forgetting is really good, because when you forget a word in a language, rather than being frustrated, it's actually a good thing, because by forcing yourself to retrieve that word, you're reinforcing that neural pathway. So forgetting something is actually a good thing for you. Sleeping on something is really, really good. I mean, when I learn something new on the piano and I get frustrated, I put it aside. I leave it, or a new dance step. I'm learning swing now with my wife, and I'm learning new dance steps. I put it aside. If I come back to it 2 days later, I'm able to do it. I was like, wow, my brain was actually learning when I got out of the way. It was learning when I was sleeping. It was forming those new neural pathways. So small steps every day, and give yourself time. Give yourself a break. And another important element is having the right amount of stretch. So again, I talked about that Goldilocks mix. We want to stretch ourselves. Stretching yourself basically means going out of your comfort zone. When you go out of your comfort zone, you're generating more noradrenaline. Okay, you don't want to generate too much where you get stressed out, but you want to go enough out of your comfort zone, because if we want to achieve something really big, we're probably going to have to change our habitual way of doing things. And the only way to do that is to go out of your comfort zone. So stretch is really important. And so if you set, small challenges each day, incremental challenges each day, they can lead to really huge changes in your life and this is true for anything. but for language learning, absolutely that's the case. Small challenges that take you out of your comfort zone a little bit, but not so much where you're totally stressed, but enough where you're challenging yourself and you're allowing yourself to build those new neural pathways. And finally, beware of the limbic response. Again, I talked about this limbic part of our brain, the amygdala, which is actually, it's part of our brain. It predates our species. It's always been there, and we have to be able to manage it. The limbic response exists all the time. It exists in all areas of life, and it's fascinating to note. I was blown away by this, but our brain perceives social pain exactly the way it perceives physical pain. Studies have been shown where they've connected people up to, they've done an MRI, brain scan, and they've shown that the same brain regions light up, the same pain areas light up when you perceive a social threat. Same pain areas as when you actually perceive physical pain, which is incredible if you think about it, because we've been taught in our culture that, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Turns out that's not the case. That for the brain, sticks and stones hurt, okay? And they're actually, David Rock developed something called the SCARF model. There are actually 5 primary social threats. There's the status, there's the, actually, and I'll go back to the SCARF model a little bit later on, but I don't want to get too technical about it, but, status, uncertainty, fairness, relatedness, and certainty. Actually, those are the 5 of them. Those could be triggered by a social event. So why do I say this? Because I think a lot of goal-setting activity is really good on paper, but people underestimate the emotional element of it. And this is true in language learning. Language learning can create some strong social threats. If for example, you're embarrassed to, a lot of us are embarrassed to speak. We're embarrassed that we can't find the right word. We're embarrassed about our accent. We're embarrassed to speak the first time. Some people talk about speaking from day one. I think it's a great method. Again, may not work for everyone, but that's definitely going to generate a threat response. What I'm doing right now, speaking in front of, public speaking can create a threat response. So just being aware that we're experiencing a threat response is already half the battle. Because once we actually giving it a name and labeling it helps a lot. Because once we get the PFC, the prefrontal cortex involved, and we give it a name, we actually dampen down that limbic response. So another thing we can do is ask people permission. People ask questions all the time. Questions are threatening. It's a really good practice before you ask someone a question is to ask permission. For example, when it comes to teachers correcting students, to ask them permission. Is it okay with you if I correct your mistakes? And when would you like me to do that? When you make them or at the end? Do you want me to do it all the time? So these kind of questions, or even placing someone in a conversation, this is what we're going to talk about today. Do you agree with this? And we're going to talk about, first we're going to talk about A, then we're going to talk about B. How does that sound? That eliminates uncertainty. It kind of dampens down this threat response. So you can bring this to teaching, coaching others, and into your own language learning. So we want to be aware of that limbic response. And as a conclusion, I would say, if I want anything that I would want you to take away from this talk, it's that neuroplasticity is really a remarkable characteristic of our brain. It's a remarkable part of being a human being. Get your brain on your side. Be aware of the limbic response. Put yourself in a toward state. Trust yourself. And let your brain work for you, because you can really do remarkable things. Thanks so much for your attention and your time, and hope to see you again. Bye-bye.